The glass was already in my hand when my husband's fingers closed around my wrist. Not gently. Hard enough to make the champagne tremble against the rim, hard enough that I almost dropped it on my mother's white tablecloth. "Don't touch that glass," Ethan said so quietly that no one else at the table heard him. I looked at him, waiting for the joke, the explanation, anything. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my sister. And for the first time in my life, I wondered why my sister needed me to drink it. 3 hours earlier, I had walked into my parents' dining room in Alexandria, still smelling faintly of jet fuel, still carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from 16 hours of travel and 4 months away. I'd flown in that morning from an overseas deployment, showered in an airport bathroom, and driven straight to a dinner I almost skipped. I told myself I wanted to be there. The truth was more complicated. Some part of me still believed that if I showed up enough times, my presence would eventually register as something worth celebrating too. My mother hugged me at the door, told me I looked tired, and asked if I'd had a hard flight. I started to answer. I got as far as "the layover in Frankfurt was rough," before she turned toward the kitchen and called out, "Caroline, tell your sister about the appointment, she'll want to hear this." 10 minutes. That's how long it took before the evening became once again entirely about my sister. I want to be honest about something because it matters for everything that came after. I didn't hate Caroline. I never had. Growing up, I actually admired her the way you admire someone who seems to have been built correctly from the start. Steady hands, quick mind, a way of walking into a room that made people lean toward her. She was 2 years older than me, and for most of my childhood I thought that explained the difference. She simply had a head start. I told myself that for a long time. But head starts don't last 20 years. When Caroline got into medical school, my parents rented a private room at a restaurant in D.C. and invited 40 people. When I received my ROTC scholarship the following spring, my father looked up from his newspaper and said, "That's good, Izzy," and went back to reading. When Caroline finished her cardiology residency, my parents hung her hospital photo, white coat, stethoscope, that practiced half-smile in the center of the living room wall, right where guests would see it first. When I made major, my mother told me she couldn't throw anything together because Caroline had a conference that same weekend, and surely I understood. I did understand. That was the problem. I understood so well that I'd stopped expecting anything different. Tonight was for Caroline again, a promotion to a leadership role at the hospital, something with a long title involving clinical excellence and strategic direction, that I didn't fully absorb because I was watching my father's face while she said it. He looked the way he always looked when Caroline spoke, like a man watching a return on an investment finally pay out. Caroline stood to give a small speech before dinner ended. She was good at this the way she was good at everything. Performative, measured pauses, a slight catch in her voice at exactly the right moment. She talked about integrity, about trust, about the responsibility that came with holding people's lives in your hands, and how she never forgot that this was at its core an act of service. I clapped along with everyone else. Ethan's hand found mine under the table, and I remember thinking absurdly that I was grateful for it, a small anchor in a room that had once again forgotten I existed. My father raised his glass. "To Caroline," he said, his voice thick with a pride I recognized instantly because I'd spent 38 years watching him wear it, and never once for me. "The daughter who has always made us proud." I felt it land somewhere under my ribs, familiar and dull, like an old bruise someone presses without knowing it's there. I didn't say anything. I'd learned not to. Reacting only ever seemed to confirm whatever story the room had already decided to tell about me, that I was sensitive, that I read too much into things, that Caroline's light didn't dim mine. So why did I always look like it did? Caroline came around the table herself to refill glasses, which struck me as oddly personal for a woman who usually let catering staff handle things like that. She reached my seat, picked up the flute in front of me from the tray, turned slightly away toward the sideboard for a few seconds, and then set it back down in front of me with a smile. "To you too, Izzy," she said. "You made it back in one piece. That's worth celebrating." It was such a normal thing to say, warm even. I almost believed it meant something. I lifted the glass. That was when Ethan's hand closed around my wrist. I turned to look at him, ready to laugh it off, to ask what on earth he was doing. But his jaw was set in a way I recognized from years of marriage to a man who noticed things other people missed for a living. A stillness that meant he was calculating something faster than he could explain it. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my sister, and my sister, I realized a half second later, was looking back at him. Not confused, not offended. Watching. I set the glass down slowly, the champagne catching the candlelight, and for the first time all evening the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with a toast. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life, and neither of us spoke until we were 2 turns away from our apartment in Arlington. "What happened back there?" I said. Not a question. I didn't have the energy to make it one. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "I saw Caroline take your glass off the tray. She turned her back for maybe 4 seconds, then she handed it to you." "That's it, that's the whole thing." I heard my own voice rise thin and tired. "Ethan, she was refilling glasses, that's what hosts do. She wasn't refilling glasses for anyone else at the table." He said it simply without drama, the way he said most things, like a man laying facts on a table rather than building an accusation. "And before dinner, she asked you twice whether you had to drive tomorrow morning or report back to your unit. Once when we arrived. Once again right before we sat down. I remembered both times. I hadn't thought anything of it sisterly small talk, the kind of question people ask when they're being polite about your schedule. But hearing it laid out like that, back to back, stripped of context, it did sound strange. "You think my sister drugged my champagne?" I said flatly, testing how absurd it sounded out loud. "I didn't say that." He finally looked at me at the red light. "I said I saw something I couldn't explain, and it made me uncomfortable enough that I wasn't going to let you drink it without asking questions first. That's all. I'm not accusing anyone of anything." I wanted to be angry with him. Some old loyal part of me, the part that had spent 38 years defending my family's version of things even when it cost me, wanted to tell him he was being paranoid, that this was what happened when you spent your career trained to see conspiracies in everything, that not every glass of champagne was evidence of something. But I hadn't drunk it. And some quieter, colder part of me was glad I hadn't. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in the dark, running the evening back like surveillance footage, watching Caroline's face at the moment she handed me the glass, trying to decide if the smile had reached her eyes. I couldn't remember. That was the worst part. I'd spent my whole life reading my sister as safe, familiar, harmless, even when she was thoughtless, and now I couldn't trust my own memory of her face. The next morning my phone buzzed before I'd even gotten out of bed. "Feeling okay this morning?" I stared at the message for a long moment before answering. I hadn't told anyone I felt off. I hadn't said a word about headaches or dizziness or anything at all. I'd gone straight from dinner to the car to bed. "I'm fine," I typed back. "Why?" "No reason," she wrote, "just checking on my little sister, Xoxo." I set the phone face down on the nightstand and sat there in the gray morning light, feeling something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite suspicion. It was closer to the sensation of standing on a floor you'd always assumed was solid and feeling for the first time the faintest give beneath your feet. That was when the memory came back uninvited and entire. 6 months earlier, after a dinner at Caroline's townhouse, I'd left feeling strange, not drunk, though I remembered Caroline commenting that I seemed a little tipsy as I said my goodbyes. I'd had 1 glass of wine over 3 hours, the kind of pace that had never once made me lightheaded in my life. But I'd woken up the next day nearly 14 hours later, groggy in a way that felt more like sedation than sleep, my head thick and my mouth dry. I'd missed a scheduled call with my command that morning, an important one tied to a deployment briefing, and spent the following week apologizing for something I couldn't fully explain, filing an incident report that used words like unexpected illness, because I genuinely didn't know what else to call it. At the time, Caroline had laughed it off gently at a family lunch a week later. "You always did have a low tolerance," she'd said, patting my hand like it was an old joke between us, and I had laughed along with her, embarrassed, assuming she was right. I'd never had a low tolerance for anything in my life. I'd spent years in officer training proving exactly the opposite. But she said it with such warm, easy confidence that I'd simply absorbed it as fact. The way I'd absorbed so many small corrections about myself over the years without ever questioning where they came from. I got out of bed and walked to the small desk in the corner of our bedroom, the one where I kept my old planners, because some habits from officer school never leave you. I flipped back 6 months, found the date, and sat staring at my own handwriting dinner at C's 7 p.m. until the letters blurred slightly at the edges. I scrolled through old texts on my phone back to that same week and found it almost immediately the way you find something you were afraid you'd find. Feeling okay this morning, Caroline had written the day after that dinner too. Nearly the same words, nearly the same time. And just like this morning, I hadn't told her I felt anything at all. I sat there on the edge of the bed for a long time, the planner open in my lap, and understood with a kind of quiet, sinking clarity that this was not the first time. Whatever had happened at that party, whatever Ethan had seen my sister do, it had a history, a pattern with a shape I was only now allowing myself to see. I closed the planner and reached for my phone to call Nathan Reed, a colleague of Caroline's I hadn't spoken to in over a year, before I even fully understood why his name had surfaced in my mind at all. I didn't reach Nathan that morning. His voicemail picked up after 4 rings, the automated greeting flat and impersonal, and I hung up without leaving a message. I wasn't even sure what I would have said. "Hi, this is Caroline. I think she might have drugged me twice. Do you have a minute?" It sounded insane, even inside my own head, so I did what I'd been trained to do instead. I documented. I sat at my desk with a legal pad, the kind I used for after-action reports, and started writing everything down in order, dates, times, exact wording of texts, who was present, what I remembered feeling. 6 months ago, dinner at Caroline's, 1 glass of wine, 14 hours of sleep, a missed briefing, a text the next morning, asking if I felt okay before I'd said a word. Last night, the glass, Ethan's hand on my wrist. The question about my schedule asked twice. Another text this morning with nearly identical phrasing. 2 data points didn't prove a pattern, but they were enough to make the hair on my arms rise every time I reread them. I've built a career on the principle that feelings aren't evidence, but they're also not nothing. They're often the first indication that evidence exists somewhere waiting to be found. Document first, act second. It had kept me alive in situations far more dangerous than a family dinner, and I saw no reason to abandon it now just because the subject was my sister instead of a supply chain irregularity. While I worked, something else nagged at me, a loose thread I hadn't pulled yet. Over the past, Caroline had asked me 3 separate times, with increasing directness, to help her get in front of the leadership at a veterans' health initiative I had some peripheral connection to through my work in military medical logistics. She wanted an introduction to a program director. She wanted her name mentioned favorably. Each time I'd deflected, telling her it would be a conflict of interest for me to broker anything like that, and each time she'd accepted it a little too quickly, a little too smoothly, moving on, as if the request had cost her nothing. I hadn't thought much of it, now I wondered. Caroline's career from the outside looked frictionless. 1 promotion after another, her name attached to papers, a reputation for brilliance that preceded her into every room. But brilliance like that requires fuel, and lately I'd caught fragments of things that suggested the fuel was running low. A comment at Thanksgiving about a grant renewal being more complicated than expected. A clipped exchange with a hospital administrator I happened to overhear at a fundraiser last spring. The kind of small cracks you only notice in retrospect once you've decided to start looking. My phone rang at 2 that afternoon. Unknown number, DC area code. "Isabella, it's Nathan Reed." His voice was careful, the tone of a man testing whether a door was actually open before he stepped through it. "I hope it's all right, I'm calling. Caroline gave me your number a while back for something unrelated, and I saw you tried to reach me this morning." "I did." I kept my voice even the way I'd learned to keep it in rooms where showing your hand too early cost you leverage. I wasn't sure what I was calling about, honestly. There was a pause on his end, long enough that I could hear a door close somewhere behind him, muffling the sound of a hallway. "Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if it's strange." "Go ahead. Has your sister ever asked you to use your position, your connections, whatever it is you have to make a problem disappear?" I sat very still at my desk. "Why would you ask me that?" Another pause, longer this time. "Because I used to work with her on a research team, and I've spent the last year trying to decide whether what I saw was something worth losing my career over, and I keep landing on the same answer, and I keep being too much of a coward to do anything about it." He told me carefully, the way people tell you things they've rehearsed alone in the shower for months. He'd worked alongside Caroline on a clinical study 2 years earlier, one tied to a promising cardiac intervention that had, according to the published results, performed remarkably well. What the published results didn't reflect, Nathan said, was a cluster of adverse events among study participants that had been quietly reclassified, downgraded in severity, or in a few cases left out of the final reporting altogether. He'd raised concerns internally. He'd been moved off the team within 6 weeks, reassigned to a research track with no clinical exposure, and not coincidentally, no future. "I don't have proof of intent," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have suspicions, I have some documents, I have a feeling I've been carrying around for 2 years that I did something wrong by staying quiet. But I don't have a smoking gun. I called because when I heard you'd tried to reach me, I thought maybe you already know something I don't." I told him carefully what had happened at dinner, what Ethan had seen, what I'd found in my old planner. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "That sounds like her," he finally said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief, something closer to relief at finally not being the only one who'd noticed. Before we hung up, he told me he'd send something over, an old email thread he said that he'd kept. He wasn't even sure why anymore, except that some instinct had told him not to delete it. It arrived 20 minutes later. A forwarded chain from 18 months ago. Caroline writing to a colleague about a scheduling conflict involving a hospital board dinner and a family obligation she was trying to avoid. Buried 3 lines down, on almost an aside, was a sentence that made my stomach drop the way solid ground does right before an earthquake. "My sister can be handled, she always comes around." I read the sentence 4 times before it fully landed. "My sister can be handled, she always comes around." Not written in anger, not written in the heat of an argument where people say things they don't mean. Written in passing an offhand line in an email about scheduling, the kind of sentence you only write about someone when the thought is already fully formed, already comfortable, already lived in. I called my parents' house 2 days later and asked if Caroline could meet me there Saturday afternoon, just the 2 of us before everyone else arrived for the weekend. My mother sounded pleased the way she always sounded when she thought her daughters were finally getting close. "That's wonderful, Izzy. She could use you right now, honestly. Work's been a lot." I didn't tell her why I wanted to see Caroline alone. The kitchen hadn't changed in 20 years. Same yellow tile, same window over the sink looking out at the dogwood tree, same worn spot on the counter where Caroline and I used to do homework side by side, her calculus and my chemistry, passing the good pen back and forth without asking. I'd loved her in that kitchen. That was the part nobody would understand later when I told this story, that even now walking in some old muscle memory in my chest still reached for her the way it always had. She arrived at 3, breezy and put together as always, dropping her bag on the chair and reaching for the kettle out of habit. "I'm starving. Did Mom leave anything?" "Caroline." Something in my voice stopped her hand on the cabinet door. She turned, and I watched her face do the thing it always did when she sensed a shift in the room before she had all the information. A kind of quick recalibration, pleasant mask, sliding fractionally, eyes sharpening. "What's wrong?" "I know about the champagne," I said. I kept my voice level, the way I'd have delivered a difficult report to a commanding officer, facts first, feeling contained. "At your promotion dinner, I know you didn't just refill my glass." For a moment she didn't move at all. Then she laughed short and disbelieving and turned back to the kettle as if the conversation were already over. "Izzy, what are you talking about?" "I also know about 6 months ago, the dinner at your place, the 14 hours of sleep, the missed briefing." I let that sit in the air between us. "You asked me if I felt okay the next morning before I'd said a word either time." She set the kettle down without filling it. When she turned back around, the pleasant mask was gone and something harder had taken its place. Something I recognized uncomfortably as the face she wore in hospital board meetings when someone questioned her numbers. "You've always been jealous of me," she said. "You know that ever since we were kids. And now you're building some kind of case against me because your husband saw me pour a drink." It was such a familiar accusation that for one disorienting second I almost apologized. That was the muscle memory again, decades of being told my hurt was actually envy, my observations, actually insecurity. I had to consciously push past it, the way you push through resistance in your own body during a hard run. "I'm not jealous of you, Caroline. I never have been. I loved you." I heard my own voice catch slightly and hated it, but kept going. That's what made it so easy for you, wasn't it? I never once thought to protect myself from you because you're my sister." Something in her expression flickered then, not quite guilt but something adjacent to it, a crack in the wall she'd built. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the fight draining out of her all at once, replaced by something more tired. "It wasn't poison," she said finally, quietly. "I need you to understand that. I would never actually hurt you. It was a sedative, something I have access to, something mild, something that would just slow you down, make you sleep through the morning. I only needed a few hours. I needed you to miss that Saturday meeting so I could get in front of the program director myself before you could tell him no again." I stared at her. "You drugged me so I'd miss a meeting. I needed the introduction, Isabella, and you wouldn't give it to me, and I was running out of time on the grant cycle." "You're a doctor." The words came out flatter and colder than I intended, but I didn't take them back. "You know exactly what it means to sedate someone without their knowledge or consent. You know the word for that. You know it's not a mistake, it's not an accident, it's a decision you make with full information about what you're doing." "I needed more time," she said again, as if repetition might make it sound less like what it was. "And 6 months ago, what did you need then?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had gone strange and small, stripped of its usual polish. "The same thing. I had a board dinner. I needed you out of the way for a night so I could handle something without you asking questions about my research numbers. You risked my career to protect yours." "You have a career," she said, and something in the way she said it made my chest go cold. "I have a reputation. Do you understand the difference? You can move units, transfer commands, start over somewhere else if something goes wrong. If my reputation collapses, there's nothing left. There's no version of Caroline Prescott that exists without it." I understood in that moment more about my sister than I had in 38 years of loving her. Not that she was evil, I didn't believe that, not even then, but that somewhere along the way her entire sense of self had fused completely with her professional image, until protecting one meant sacrificing anything, including me, without it registering as a real cost. We heard footsteps on the stairs before either of us could say anything else. My mother appeared in the doorway, drawn by voices she'd clearly been half listening to from the hall, her face already arranging itself into the practiced neutrality she used whenever her daughters disagreed. "What's going on down here?" Caroline recovered faster than I expected, straightening in her chair, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Nothing, Mom. Izzy and I were just talking." My mother looked between us, and I watched her make the choice. She always made the choice that had shaped both of our entire lives without her ever fully admitting it to herself. "She made a mistake," my mother said gently, and I understood she'd heard enough of the conversation to know roughly what we were discussing and had decided in advance which of us needed defending. "No, Mom." I stood up from the table, feeling something settle inside me, cold and clear as glass. "She made a decision, twice." Caroline's eyes flicked up to mine, and for just a second before she composed herself again, I saw real fear there. "You don't have anything, Isabella. It's your word against mine. Who exactly is going to believe you over me?" She said it like a door closing. She had no idea I'd already been documenting for 2 weeks, no idea about Nathan, no idea about the email sitting saved in 3 different places outside her reach. I almost told her right then. Instead, I picked up my bag, kissed my mother's cheek out of an old habit I didn't examine too closely, and walked out to my car where Ethan was waiting exactly where he said he'd be. Nathan called back the following Tuesday, and this time his voice had a different quality, less hesitant, more resolved, like a man who'd finally stopped weighing a decision and simply made it. He told me he'd spent the weekend going through old files he'd saved from his time on Caroline's research team, files he'd kept in a personal folder without ever quite admitting to himself why. He said he was ready to report what he knew through the hospital's official compliance channel, not to me. Not informally, but through the process that existed for exactly this reason. "I should have done this 2 years ago," he said. "I told myself I was protecting my career. I think I was really just scared of her. I understood that fear better than I wanted to. I want to be clear about something, because it mattered to me even in the middle of everything. I never once considered turning this into some kind of private investigation. Ethan's job gave him access to skills and instincts most people didn't have, but he never used a single resource from his work to dig into my sister. He wasn't going to run her name through a database or pull a favor from a contact. What he'd seen at that dinner, he'd seen with his own eyes. the way any observant person might. Everything after that belonged to the proper channel's legal professional human. So that's where I put it. I met with a lawyer recommended by a friend from my unit, a woman who specialized in cases involving workplace and family disputes with a criminal dimension, and I laid out everything I had, the planner entries, the texts, the timeline, my own account of what Caroline had admitted to me in the kitchen. She listened without much visible reaction the way professionals do when they've heard worse, and told me my documentation was better than most people managed. That the consistency between the two incidents strengthened the case considerably, and that I should file a report with local law enforcement regarding what had happened to me directly, separate from whatever the hospital chose to do about the research issues Nathan was raising. I did. It felt strange sitting across from a detective in a small municipal office describing my own sister's behavior in clipped procedural language, watching him write it all down without any of the emotional weight I carried into that room. To him it was a case number. To me it was the sound of something ending that I'd spent my whole life trying to hold together. Nathan filed his report the same week through the hospital's compliance office, laying out what he'd witnessed regarding the clinical study, the underreported adverse events, the pattern of reclassification, the timeline of his own removal from the project shortly after he'd raised concerns. Once that report existed on paper, inside an official system with its own momentum, it stopped being something either of us could control. An internal investigation opened within days. Caroline found out fast, she always did. She called our parents first, not me, which told me everything about her strategy before she'd said a word of it. My father called that evening, his voice tight in a way I rarely heard from him. "Your sister says you and Ethan are trying to destroy her career," he said, skipping any greeting at all. "She says you're jealous that you've always been jealous and now you're using some old misunderstanding to go after her professionally. Isabella, she could lose everything." "Dad," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "why is what Caroline could lose more important to you than what she chose to do?" He didn't answer that. The silence stretched long enough that I heard him exhale on the other end, the sound of a man who didn't want to be having this conversation and had no idea how to end it gracefully. "She's your sister," he finally said, as if that alone settled something. "I know exactly who she is," I said. "I don't think you do. Not yet." I hung up gently, not out of anger, but because I understood there was nothing more useful I could say to him in that moment. Some things people have to arrive at on their own timeline, if they arrive at all. The hospital's investigation moved faster than any of us expected, in part because once compliance officers started pulling the research files, they found more than Nathan had even reported. It wasn't a single adverse event quietly buried. It was a pattern spanning 18 months, mislabeled complications, incomplete follow-up documentation, statistical outcomes that had been massaged in ways that fell somewhere between poor judgment and deliberate misrepresentation. I want to be fair to my sister even now, even after everything. I don't believe she set out to hurt the patients in that study. I believe she was terrified of failure, terrified of losing the reputation she'd built her entire identity around, and that terror led her to make choices that compounded on each other until there was no clean way back. That didn't make the choices any less serious, it just made them human in the worst possible way. A week after Nathan's report went in, I got a call from the hospital's legal department, informing me as the person who had separately filed a police report involving a family member on staff that Dr. Caroline Prescott had been placed on administrative suspension, pending the outcome of both investigations. The woman on the phone read it to me in careful, neutral language, the kind designed to give away nothing, but I understood exactly what it meant. I hung up and sat in my car in a parking lot for a long time before I could make myself drive home. My mother called that same evening. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, her voice was tight with a grief that had nowhere else to go except toward me. "Look what you did to your sister," she said. I didn't say anything for a moment, letting the accusation sit there in the space between us, feeling its familiar shape settle over me like an old coat I'd worn too many times. "I didn't do anything to her, Mom," I finally said. "She did this. All I did was stop protecting her from it." My mother was crying now quietly, the sound muffled like she had her hand over the phone. She's going to lose her career, Isabella. Everything she worked for." "I know," I said, and found to my own surprise that I meant it gently rather than coldly. I'm sorry that's true, I really am, but it doesn't change what she did to me, twice. She didn't have anything to say to that. We stayed on the line another few seconds, neither of us hanging up, both of us listening to the silence hold everything neither of us knew how to say. My parents called a family meeting 11 days later, the kind of gathering that used to mean holiday dinners, and now meant something closer to a tribunal. My mother phrased it carefully on the phone. Just the four of us and Caroline, we need to talk this through as a family. But I understood before I hung up exactly what they wanted from me. Not understanding, not reconciliation. A retraction, or at least something soft enough to pass for one. I almost didn't go. Ethan asked me gently whether I needed to. "You don't owe them this," he said, standing in our kitchen while I stared at my keys on the counter, unable to decide. "You've already done everything right. You don't have to sit in a room and defend it." "I know," I said. "I think I need to see it through anyway, for myself, not for them." He nodded and didn't argue further. That was one of the things I loved most about him. He never once tried to manage my choices, even when he clearly worried about the cost of them. The house felt different when I walked in. Smaller somehow, though nothing had physically changed. My father greeted me with a stiff hug and didn't quite meet my eyes. My mother had made coffee nobody drank. We sat in the living room under Caroline's old hospital photo still hanging on the wall and waited for her to come down from the guest room, where she'd apparently been staying since her suspension began. When she finally appeared, I barely recognized her. Caroline had always carried herself like someone accustomed to being looked at, shoulders back, chin level, the practiced composure of a woman who'd spent 15 years being the most competent person in every room she entered. That was gone. She looked thinner than I remembered from 2 weeks earlier, her hair pulled back carelessly, dark circles under eyes that used to be her best feature. She sat across from me without her usual authority, and for a moment I felt something twist painfully in my chest that had nothing to do with anger. My father spoke first, his voice carefully rehearsed. "We just want to find a way through this as a family. Isabella, is there any room to reconsider what you told the police? Maybe you misunderstood the situation. Maybe there's a version of this that doesn't end with your sister's entire career destroyed." "Dad, I didn't misunderstand anything," I said quietly. "I told them exactly what happened. I'm not going to change my account of my own life to protect Caroline from the consequences of what she did to me." My mother reached for my hand, her eyes wet. "She's your sister, Isabella. Family forgives." "I haven't said I won't forgive her someday," I said. And I meant it, though I wasn't sure yet if it was true. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as pretending it didn't happen or lying to make it disappear faster. Caroline had been silent the whole time, staring at her hands in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You finally got what you wanted," she said, not looking up. "What exactly do you think I wanted?" "To see me fall." Her eyes lifted to mine, then red-rimmed, and for a moment I saw something in her face I hadn't seen since we were children. Real, unguarded hurt, without the performance layered over it. "You've been waiting your whole life for a chance to bring me down to your level." I felt something crack open in my chest, 38 years of accumulated silence finally finding its way out, and I let it. "I spent 30 years watching everyone lift you up," I said. "Every dinner, every announcement, every photo on that wall. I never needed you to fall, Caroline. I never once wanted that. I just needed you to stop standing on me to stay up there." The room went completely still. My mother's hand tightened around mine, though I couldn't tell if it was in comfort or an attempt to stop me from saying more. My father stared at the coffee table like it might offer him an escape route. Caroline's face crumpled just slightly before she caught herself and rebuilt the wall. "I never meant for it to be like this." "I know," I said, and I found that I did believe her in the narrow, specific sense that I don't think she'd ever sat down and planned to hurt me deliberately, cruelty by design. But intention had never been the question. What she'd done was what she'd done, regardless of the story she told herself about why. I didn't ask her to apologize. I didn't demand she admit every detail out loud in front of our parents, though some old part of me still wanted that, still wanted the neat cinematic ending where she broke down completely, and everyone finally saw clearly. That wasn't going to happen, not that day, maybe not ever in the way I'd once imagined satisfaction would feel. Instead, I stood up. "I'm not going to change what I told them," I said to the room generally, though I was really speaking to my parents. "I'm not going to pretend I imagined this or that it was some kind of misunderstanding between sisters. What happens to Caroline's career now isn't something I control. And honestly, it isn't something I want to control. That's between her and the people whose job it is to look at what she did." My mother started to say something else, but I was already moving toward the door, my legs carrying me forward with a steadiness I didn't entirely feel yet. Ethan was parked exactly where he said he'd be engine idling, waiting without a single question on his face. I got in beside him and sat for a moment, looking back at the house where I'd grown up at the porch light my mother always left on even in daylight out of habit. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his hand finding mine across the console. I thought about it honestly before I answered, turning the question over the way I'd learned to turn over everything now carefully without rushing toward the comfortable answer. "I think I finally am," I said. He didn't say anything else. He just squeezed my hand once and pulled out of the driveway, and I let myself, for the first time in weeks, breathe all the way out. A year passed the way years do when you stop measuring time by the people who used to define it for you, quietly, steadily, in a direction that surprised me by feeling like forward motion instead of loss. The hospital's investigation concluded 4 months after that afternoon in my parents' living room. Caroline resigned from her leadership position before the board could formally terminate her, which her lawyer had apparently advised as the cleaner path, and she surrendered her role on the research team entirely. The medical board opened its own separate review into the clinical study irregularities, a process that was, as far as I understood from the little Caroline's world, still reached me, still grinding forward slowly the way these things do. I didn't follow it closely. I'd made peace somewhere in those months with the fact that I didn't need to witness every consequence to know that consequences were finally happening. My own career moved in a direction I hadn't expected but had in some quiet way earned entirely on my own. I was offered a new assignment coordinating medical logistics for a joint veterans health initiative, the very kind of program Caroline had once wanted an introduction to, not because of any family connection, but because my record spoke for itself once someone finally bothered to read it without comparing it to my sister's. I remember sitting in the assignment briefing thinking, with a strange, quiet ache, that I finally had something that was entirely mine, built without anyone's permission or oversight. My relationship with my parents didn't collapse the way I once feared it might, but it didn't return to what it had been either. It became something new and unfamiliar, a relationship built on more honest, if smaller, terms. My father surprised me most. A few months after that final conversation in the living room, he called me on a Tuesday evening for no particular reason, which he'd never once done in my adult life. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, my new assignment, a home repair he was struggling with, and near the end, almost as an aside, he said, "I've been thinking about a lot of things, Izzy, about how we ran this family. I don't think I ever really saw you clearly. I'm sorry for that." It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't undo 20 years of raised glasses that never once found their way to me, but I could hear that it cost him something to say it, and I let that be enough. My mother struggled more and still does in her way. She loves Caroline with a fierce, uncomplicated loyalty that doesn't leave much room for holding her accountable, and I've had to accept that some people simply aren't built to look directly at the harm someone they love has caused. I stopped waiting for her to fully see it. I set a boundary instead, quietly, without an ultimatum. I would still call her, still visit, still be her daughter, but I would no longer sit through